The Soviet Union was a country that existed from 1922 to 1991 and was located in Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. It was a single-party communist state that was ruled by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was the largest country in the world by land area, and it was made up of 15 republics that were each semi-autonomous. The Soviet Union was a major world power and played a significant role in international relations during the 20th century. It was a founding member of the United Nations and was one of the superpowers during the Cold War, along with the United States. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and its 15 constituent republics became independent countries. But what if the Soviet Union managed to conquer the world? This is what we will discuss in this video. In 1917, Bolshevik revolutionaries overthrown Russian provisional government in October Revolution. On November 7, 1917, the Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the Russian provisional government in what is known as the October Revolution. The Bolsheviks, who were a small faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, had gained popular support due to their commitment to ending the war and redistributing land to the peasants. The provisional government, which had been in power since the February Revolution earlier that year, had failed to deliver on its promises of peace and land reform, leading to growing discontent amongst the Russian people. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks staged a coup d'etat in order to seize power from the provisional government. On October 25, the Bolsheviks seized control of key government buildings and strategic points in Petrograd, the capital of Russia at the time. The provisional government was quickly overthrown and the Bolsheviks declared a new government in its place. This new government was known as the Council of People's Commissars and it was led by Lenin. This marked the beginning of the Russian Revolution and the start of the Soviet Union. 1918, Soviet Union established. The White Army, which represented a sizable coalition of loosely united troops including monarchists, capitalists, and proponents of alternative versions of socialism, was destroyed by the Red Army, which was supported by the Bolshevik government. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was established by a 1918 treaty between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, modern Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The newly formed Communist Party, headed by Vladimir Lenin, a Marxist revolutionary, seized power. In this timeline, the Soviet Union was established about 4 years earlier. 1919, Communist revolutionaries established Soviet republics in Hungary and Germany. In our timeline, the Hungarian Socialist Federative Republic of Councils, commonly known as the Hungarian Soviet Republic, was a short-lived communist state that existed from March 21, 1919 to August 1, 1919. It was a rump state, only controlling 23% of Hungary's historic territory. The government was led by Sándor Garbe, but the main figure was Béla Kun from the Hungarian Communist Party. The state was unsuccessful in reaching an agreement with the Triple Entente, was involved in territorial disputes with neighboring countries, and faced internal social changes. They had a small volunteer army, but ultimately failed in their objectives and was abolished a few months after its existence. The year 1919 was a tumultuous one for Europe. After the destruction of the First World War, discontented masses were looking for a new way of life. In the wake of these changes, communist revolutionaries were determined to create a new world order. The first steps were taken in Hungary, where the communists sought to take advantage of the chaos and uncertainty that had been left in the wake of the war. Led by Bela Kun, the communists declared the formation of the Hungarian Soviet Republic on March 21. The new republic promised to bring about a new era of freedom and equality, one in which the working classes would have a voice and a say in their own destinies. However, the dream of the revolution quickly turned into a nightmare. The Hungarian Soviet Republic soon descended into chaos and violence, as the government struggled to keep control of the situation. The government resorted to increasingly authoritarian measures, such as arresting dissidents and introducing a brutal secret police force. In addition, the government also implemented policies that were deemed oppressive and unpopular, such as the confiscation of private property and the imposition of heavy taxes. The Hungarian Soviet Republic was not temporary, as it was not overthrown in August of the same year. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and soon the communist revolutionaries had their sights set on Germany. In our timeline, the People's State of Bavaria was a short-lived socialist state that existed in Bavaria from 1918 to 1919. It was established during the German Revolution and led by Kurt Eisner until his assassination in February 1919. It coexisted with the rival Bavarian Soviet Republic from 6 April 1919 and was dissolved upon the establishment of the Free State of Bavaria on 14 August 1919. The Bavarian Soviet Republic was a short-lived socialist state in Bavaria during the German Revolution in 1919. It was established after the demise of Kurt Eisner's People's State of Bavaria and sought to create a socialist republic, but was overthrown by elements of the German army and the Freikorps less than a month later. Several individuals involved in its overthrow later joined the Nazi Party. In this timeline, in November of 1919, the German Communist Party, the KPD, declared a revolution in Berlin. The revolutionaries quickly formed a Soviet republic, the Red Republic, which promised a new kind of government based on the principles of socialism. The Red Republic was to last for long, as it was not overthrown in 1920. 1920, decisive communist victory in Battle of Warsaw. Poland falls under communist control. In our timeline, the Battle of Warsaw in 1920 was a decisive victory for the Poles in the Russo-Polish War, resulting in the establishment of the Russo-Polish border that lasted until 1939. The Bolshevik Red Army suffered a humiliating defeat after their attempted invasion of Poland, which prevented a similar invasion of Germany. The Polish victory united all classes of people against the invading Russians, and Polish commander Joseph Pilsudski's counterattack proved successful. The Red Army suffered heavy losses, and Lenin was forced to agree to terms that ceded large tracts of land to Poland. It was 1920, and the world had changed. After the end of the Great War, the world had been plunged into chaos, with the old empires crumbling and new nation-states emerging. In Poland, the country was being invaded by the newly formed Soviet Union. In June, the Red Army began its march on Warsaw. The Soviet Union had been amassing an impressive force along the Polish border, with the intent to invade and claim the country as part of the Greater Soviet territory. In the summer of 1920, the Bolsheviks had already made great strides in their campaign to expand their influence in the region, and the Battle of Warsaw was the next step in the process. The Soviet Union had great advantage in the battle, as they had far more troops and a much larger arsenal of weapons. However, the Polish forces were well trained and determined to defend their homeland. The Soviet Union began the battle with a massive artillery barrage, which had the desired effect of weakening the Polish forces. The Red Army then moved in with infantry and tanks, quickly overrunning the Polish forces. However, the Polish forces did not surrender, and the battle continued to rage on for several days. The Polish army, though brave and determined, was no match for the might of the Soviet forces, and by mid-July the city had been surrounded. The Polish government, recognizing the futility of their situation, ordered a retreat, and the Red Army entered the city on the 17th of July. The Polish people were resigned to their fate as the communist flag was raised over the city. The Battle of Warsaw had been won by the Reds, and Poland had fallen under communist control. In the months that followed, the new communist government set to work transforming the country. Strict censorship was imposed, with all political opposition crushed. The economy was restructured and the land was redistributed. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced as the new government sought to create a socialist state. The Battle of Warsaw was a decisive victory for communism, and the effects of the victory were felt throughout Europe. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union would expand its power across the region, transforming the continent into an ideological battleground between the East and West. The Battle of Warsaw was a turning point in history, and the consequences of the communist victory would be felt for years to come. The people of Poland, however, never forgot the courage and determination of the Polish people who fought bravely against the odds. The memory of the Battle of Warsaw remains alive in the hearts of the people and will continue to be remembered for generations to come. 1920 for 1929, post-World War I borders stabilize, with the Soviet Union controlling all of the former Russian Empire, Serbia, Romania, most of former Austria-Hungary territory, and most of Germany outside the Rhineland, which remains under Allied occupation. The end of World War I in 1918 brought about a period of chaos and uncertainty for Serbia, as the country was broken up between several different countries and forced to accept a series of difficult treaties. After years of unrest, Serbia finally found some semblance of stability in 1920 when the Soviet Union took control of the region. The Soviet Union was determined to bring an end to the fighting and to restore peace and order to the region. In order to do that, they set up a series of strict but fair laws and regulations to ensure the safety of all Serbians. They also implemented a land reform program which redistributed land and gave the people access to resources and education. The reforms were a success, and the people of Serbia were able to start rebuilding their lives and their homes. In addition, the Soviet Union provided economic aid and social services to the people of Serbia, helping them to get back on their feet for as long as they were loyal to the Soviet Union. By 1925, the Soviet Union had secured its borders and was firmly in control of Serbia. The people of Serbia were able to finally look to the future and start to rebuild their lives in some sort of peace and security. In 1926, the Soviet Union, under the leadership of Stalin, had quickly capitalized on their victory and had established a communist regime in Romania, with Stalin taking control. As the Soviet Union strengthened their grip on Romania, they began to push off the old regime and establish their own laws and regulations. The Romanian people were not happy with the new regime, and many of them resisted the Soviet Union's rule. But despite their resistance, the Soviet Union managed to hold on to Romania, and the borders of Europe were once again redrawn. The Soviet Union's control of Romania brought about significant changes to the country and its people. Romanians were stripped of their rights, and the economy was drastically altered. The Romanian people were now beholden to the Soviet Union for their economic and political freedoms. It was 1928, and the Soviet Union had taken control of much of the former Austria-Hungary territory. This was a major shift in the European balance of power, and it had major implications for the region. Austria-Hungary had been a major power in Europe for centuries, but it had been weakened by the First World War. Now, the Soviet Union had taken control of the region, implementing its own form of socialism. The people of the former Austria-Hungary territory were not happy about this. Many of them had fought in the war and were used to their own way of life. They were not happy about the Soviet Union's control over their lives. The Soviet Union was determined to hold on to its new territory. However, it had invested a lot of money and resources into the region and did not want to let it go, in an effort to control the people that lived in the former Austria-Hungary territory. The Soviet Union implemented strict rules and regulations. It also installed its own people in positions of power. This was done to ensure that the Soviet Union had complete control over the region. The people of Austria-Hungary had to adjust to the new way of life, but they were not happy about it. They had lost the freedom they once had and were now under the control of the Soviet Union. It was a difficult time for the people of Austria-Hungary, but they were determined to fight back. They organized protests and rallies to try to push back against the Soviet Union. In the end, the Soviet Union held firm onto its new territory, but the people still had the courage to fight for their freedom. In 1929, Stalin's plans came to fruition when he launched his invasion of Germany with the help of the Red Republic. Over 1 million Soviet troops crossed the border and began their march towards Berlin. The German army was no match for the Soviet forces, and the Red Army quickly took control of the cities of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg. The Rhineland is the only part of Germany not conquered. The Soviet Union had quickly assumed control of the former Russian Empire, Serbia, Romania, and most of Austria-Hungary and Germany outside the Rhineland. With the new borders in place, the Soviet Union began to quickly modernize and develop its newfound territories. Factories were built, farms were expanded, and the roads and railways were updated. Education and healthcare were improved, and the standard of living in the Soviet Union rose dramatically. The European powers were greatly alarmed at the Soviet Union's rapid expansion. Fearing that the Soviets were attempting to create a new empire, they began to take steps to ensure their own security. Economic sanctions were imposed on the Soviet Union, and military forces were moved to the borders to deter any possible aggression. 1930 to 1933, famine kills 17 million in southern Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. The year was 1932, and the Soviet Union under Stalin was in the midst of a famine that would later become known as the Holodomor. This famine was intentional and was used by Stalin as a weapon of mass destruction. He wanted to control the people of southern Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, and in order to do so he used starvation as a weapon to kill over 17 million people in the areas. It started as a way to force the collectivization of the farms and to prevent any opposition to his rule. The first signs of the famine began in 1932 when the government started to ration food in the affected areas. This led to a dramatic decrease in food production, as the farmers were now unable to produce enough to feed their families. With the food supply rapidly decreasing, the people of southern Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan were left to starve. The government was aware of the situation and did nothing to help. Instead, they enforced even harsher rationing that further exacerbated the famine. By 1933, the famine had become a full-blown crisis and the people were dying in droves. Reports of mass starvation were heard throughout the region as the death toll began to rise. People were eating grass and bark just to stay alive, and many of them died in the process. It is estimated that the famine killed over 17 million people in the region, and it was intentionally orchestrated by Stalin in an attempt to control the people. The Holodomor was a horrific event that left a lasting mark on the people of southern Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. (1933–1934). Soviet Union annexes Mongolia, Iran, and eastern Turkey. The Soviet Union had long been a thorn in the side of many of its neighbors, with its aggressive expansionist policies and its desire to expand its influence. In 1933, the Soviet Union set its sights on Mongolia, Iran, and eastern Turkey. In Mongolia, the Soviet Union was able to craft a diplomatic agreement that allowed it to annex the region, with the Mongolian government agreeing to certain concessions in exchange for their submission. The Mongolian government was also given a voice in the Soviet Union's decision-making process, giving it a measure of autonomy. However, the Mongolian population was not as eager to accept the Soviet Union's rule. Many of the people were wary of the new government and its policies, and the Soviet Union had to work hard to win over the people's trust. The Soviet Union eventually won over the people of Mongolia by bringing in economic and social reforms. The Soviet Union implemented a land reform policy, which redistributed land to the people and also provided educational and healthcare services. The Mongolian people slowly began to accept the Soviet Union's rule, and by 1930 the Soviet Union had successfully annexed Mongolia. The Mongolian people had gained a measure of autonomy and were no longer subjected to the whims of foreign powers. The Soviet Union's annexation of Mongolia was a watershed moment in the region's history, and it changed the course of the region for decades to come. In Iran, the Soviet Union was able to leverage its influence to pressure the Iranian government into signing a treaty that allowed the Soviets to annex the region. The Iranian government was also given a voice in the Soviet Union's decision-making process. The Soviet Union was keen to expand its power and influence in the region, and the annexation of Iran provided them with a strategic foothold in the Middle East. The Soviets also wanted to ensure that the Iranian government was friendly to their interests, as Iran was an important part of the Soviet Union's regional strategy. The Iranians, however, were not happy with the treaty and the Soviet Union's increasing influence in the region. As a result, they began to organize protests and demonstrations against the Soviet Union's actions. The protests and demonstrations did not last long, however, as the Soviet Union responded with a heavy-handed repression of any resistance. The Soviet Union had no intention of allowing the Iranian people to stand in their way and quickly put an end to the protests. The Soviet Union was successful in annexing Iran, and the region eventually became part of the Soviet Union. This allowed the Soviets to gain control of important resources in the region, such as oil and other natural resources. It also allowed them to expand their influence and power within the region. Finally, in eastern Turkey, the Soviet Union was able to use its military might to annex the region. The Turks were unwilling to engage in a full-scale war with the Soviet Union and so were forced to accept the annexation of their eastern provinces. The annexation of eastern Turkey was met with mixed reactions from the Turks. On one hand, they were relieved that the Soviet Union was not in direct control of their country, and that the Soviet troops were mainly in the east. On the other hand, they were not happy about the loss of the eastern provinces, which had been part of the Turkish nation for centuries. Nevertheless, the people of eastern Turkey had to accept the new reality and make the best of it. The Soviet Union used the annexed regions to further their own interests. They started to build modern infrastructure and transportation links, as well as factories to produce goods for the Soviet economy. They also set up a number of military bases in the region, as well as naval and air bases. This allowed them to project their influence further into the Middle East and the Caucasus. The annexation of eastern Turkey changed the geopolitical landscape of the region and the world. The Soviets now had direct access to the Mediterranean Sea and the Middle East, and they were able to project their power into the region. This was a major advantage for the Soviet Union and their allies, allowing them to keep their enemies in check. The annexation of eastern Turkey also had a lasting impact on the people of the region. The Turkish people had to adjust to a new way of life, one that was heavily influenced by the Soviet Union. This was a difficult adjustment, as the culture and lifestyle of the Turks clashed with the Soviet way of life. The people had to learn a new language and a new way of doing things, and many had to face discrimination from the Soviet authorities. With the annexation of these three regions, the Soviet Union had cemented its position as one of the most powerful countries in the world, and its influence and power would only grow in the years to come. 1936–1938, 3 million killed in Great Purge. The Great Purge of 1936–1938 was a devastating period in Soviet history, resulting in the death of an estimated 3 million people. It was one of the most brutal acts of political repression ever seen, and its legacy still lives on today. The Great Purge was initiated by Stalin in his pursuit of absolute power. The state security apparatus was mobilized to target and eliminate anyone who was perceived as a threat to the Soviet state. This included anyone who expressed dissent, was labeled a class enemy, or was deemed a socially dangerous element. The purge began with mass arrests and executions, followed by organized and systematic deportations to labor camps and gulags. The victims were subjected to forced labor, torture, and starvation. Those who survived were often subjected to further oppressive measures, such as being sent to prison camps. The Great Purge had a devastating impact on the Soviet people. Thousands of families were left without their loved ones, and a deep mistrust of the government was instilled in the hearts of many. It also had a severe economic impact, as the Soviet economy was weakened by the loss of millions of skilled workers. 1940–1949, World War II. Soviets' victory against Allies, with the Soviets gaining control of all of Eurasia and most of Africa. The year is 1949 and the world is in a state of disarray. World War II, which started in 1940, between the Allies and the Soviet Union, had just come to an end and the results were shocking. The Soviet Union had emerged the victor, gaining control of all of Eurasia and most of Africa. The Allies, consisting of the United States, Great Britain, France, and other countries, had been vanquished by the might of the Red Army. The Soviet Union had achieved something that no other nation had ever been able to do before. It had conquered Eurasia and most of Africa. The Soviet Union's victory had been a long time coming. Its leader, Joseph Stalin, had been building up its military might since the late 1930s, with the intention of taking over the world. He had been able to do this due to the massive industrialization of the Soviet Union in the years leading up to the war. The Soviet Union emerged as the most powerful nation in the world. Their economy had grown exponentially, and their military was now the most powerful force on the planet. The Soviets were now able to project their power and influence all over the world. But the war had not been without casualties. The Soviet Union's victory had been costly, with millions of lives lost in the process. The world had changed drastically since 1940. The Soviets had used their newfound power to spread their influence and ideology across the globe, creating a new era of Cold War politics. The world would never be the same again. 1950–1951, the borders of Europe were redrawn by the Soviets. Most notable changes. As the sun rose over the Swiss Alps, the people of Switzerland were shocked to see the armies of communist France, Italy, and Germany pouring over their borders. The once united nation was now divided, with the French-speaking region in the west annexed by France, the German-speaking region in the north annexed by Germany, and the Italian-speaking region in the south annexed by Italy. The Swiss military, though brave and well-trained, was no match for the overwhelming numbers of the invading armies. City after city fell, and the Swiss people were forced to flee for their lives. The Swiss people were devastated by the news, and many took up arms to defend their homes and families. But despite their valiant efforts, the three powerful nations were as strong, and the Swiss resistance was quickly crushed. In the French-speaking region, the people were forced to adapt to the ways of their new overlords, and many were forced to flee to the mountains to escape persecution. In the German-speaking region, the people were subjected to harsh laws and strict regulations, and their economy was controlled by the Germans. And in the Italian-speaking region, the people were forced to give up their cultural traditions and adopt Italian customs. As the months went by, the Swiss became a shadow of their former selves, with the once proud people living in fear and oppression. In Spain, the Catalans, a people who had long lived in the northeastern corner of Spain, began to demand independence from the central government. The Galicians, who lived in the northwestern corner of the country, also began to demand autonomy from Madrid. As the movement for Catalan and Galician autonomy grew, Madrid began to make concessions. It granted more autonomy to each region, allowing them to decide their own laws and regulations. But it soon became clear that the concessions would not be enough. The Catalans and the Galicians wanted to be fully independent from the Spanish government. After days of negotiations, the two sides finally reached an agreement. Spain officially split into the Republic of Catalonia and the Republic of Galicia. Each republic had its own government, laws, and currency. The news spread like wildfire throughout the country of North Macedonia. Bulgaria had declared their intention to annex the country, and tensions had been steadily rising between the two countries. The North Macedonian government had been desperately trying to find a diplomatic solution, but in the end, it was not enough to stop the Bulgarian forces from invading. The Bulgarian army had quickly surrounded the main cities, and with superior numbers and weaponry, the North Macedonians were quickly overwhelmed. In a matter of days, the Bulgarian forces had taken control of the country, and the North Macedonian government had been forced to surrender. For the citizens of North Macedonia, life under Bulgarian rule was difficult. The Bulgarian government imposed heavy taxes, and the people were subjected to strict laws and regulations. In addition, the Bulgarian forces were known for their brutality, and many people lived in fear of being arrested or worse. Still, life was not all bad. The Bulgarian government invested heavily in infrastructure, and the country experienced a period of economic growth. With the Balkan Wars still fresh in the minds of many, Bulgaria also took steps to try and create peace in the region. However, while some North Macedonians may have benefited from the annexation, most people did not. It was a dark time for Britain. The once proud nation had fallen under the control of the Soviet Union, becoming a puppet state. The people were miserable, living under the oppressive rule of their Soviet overlords. As the days passed, the situation only worsened. The Soviet Union exerted its influence over every aspect of British life, dictating policy and controlling the economy. The once free people of Britain were now living in a totalitarian state, with no hope of escape. But not everyone was willing to accept their fate. A small group of rebels, determined to restore Britain to its former glory, began to organize a resistance movement. They knew that the odds were against them, but they were willing to risk everything to take back their country. As the rebels gained support, the Soviet Union grew increasingly worried. They knew that they could not allow the resistance to succeed, and so they began to crack down on the rebels, using their full military might to crush the uprising. As punishment, Great Britain is divided into England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. 1950 to 1953, the former borders of European, African, and Asian colonies were redrawn by the Soviets. Africa's and Asia's borders have been redrawn to create low-level ethnic tension. Low-level ethnic tensions can arise due to a variety of factors, including cultural differences, competition for resources, and a history of conflict or injustice. These tensions may manifest in a number of ways, such as discrimination, prejudice, and misunderstandings between different ethnic groups. In some cases, low-level ethnic tensions may be inflamed by outside forces, such as political leaders or media outlets, who seek to exploit these tensions for their own gain. This can lead to an escalation of tensions, which can ultimately result in violence and conflict. These new political entities have created a patchwork of ethnic enclaves, with each group largely isolated from the others. This has led to misunderstandings, discrimination, and prejudice between the different ethnic groups. The governments of these new nations have done little to address these tensions, and in some cases have even encouraged them for their own political gain. As a result, the low-level ethnic tensions have continued to simmer, threatening to boil over into more serious conflicts. In real life, the Soviets may have done this on purpose in Central Asia, dividing an area with strong opposition to Soviet rule into arbitrary ethnic-based divisions to weaken it. 1950–1956 Nuclear arms race between Soviet Union and United States. It was a time of great tension and fear. The Cold War had begun, and the United States and Soviet Union were locked in a bitter nuclear arms race. Both sides had powerful weapons, and each was determined to outdo the other. The United States had developed the atomic bomb, and the Soviet Union had followed suit. The two nations had also developed nuclear missiles, which were capable of delivering the destructive power of the atomic bomb over great distances. The Cold War was a time of heightened tensions, and the nuclear arms race was a major factor in the fear and paranoia that gripped the world. The US and the Soviets were constantly developing new and more powerful weapons, and each was determined to keep up with the other. 1951–1954 Revolt in the Philippines suppressed, island's population reduced by 45%. The year was 1951. The Soviet Union had been slowly gaining power in the Philippines. The people of the Philippines had grown tired of the oppressive rule of the Soviets, and they decided to take a stand. The first major act of defiance took place in the city of Manila, when a group of brave men and women, led by a young leader named Nathaniel, took to the streets and tore down the Soviet flags that had been raised over the city. This marked the beginning of the revolt against the Soviet Union. The revolt quickly spread throughout the country, with many cities and towns joining in the fight against the Soviet Union. In some cases, the revolt became violent, with violent clashes between the revolutionaries and the Soviet troops. The uprising was eventually put down by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union soon sent in troops to stop the revolt and take control of the islands. The Soviets had plans for the islands, plans that would lead to the complete subjugation of the people. The Soviets' first act was to impose a new government on the islands. This government was led by a puppet leader who followed the orders of the Soviets without question. The Soviets then imposed a harsh regime of taxation, conscription, and censorship on the people. The people of the Philippines fought back, but they could not match the military might of the Soviet Union. Eventually, the revolt was suppressed, and the islands were firmly under the control of the Soviets. In the following years, the Soviet Union worked to reduce the population of the islands by 45%. This was done through a combination of forced deportations, killings, and famine. Those who were unable to flee were forced to live under the oppressive rule of the Soviets. But the people of the Philippines never forgot the courage of the revolutionaries and the spirit of their fight against oppression. The revolt in the Philippines stands as a reminder of the power of the people and their right to stand up against oppressive forces. Its legacy has been carried on since then, inspiring many to take up the fight for freedom and justice.